Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Poetry, a very short introduction, by Bernard O'Donoghue, narrated by Roger Clark. Introduction. Is poetry important? Certainly, grand claims have been made for it. The English Romantic poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley, ended his defense of poetry in 1821 with the ringing claim that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. And the first sense in the Oxford English Dictionary, OED, recognizes the exalted nature of poetry, defining it as imaginative literature as a whole at its most exalted. But the OED also recognizes a familiar, more explicit and practical sense. 2a. The art or work of a poet. A. Composition in verse or some comparable patterned arrangement of language in which the expression of feelings and ideas is given intensity by the use of distinctive style and rhythm, the art of such a composition. In considering the later history of poetry in English, the more conceptual sense has been particularly authoritative since Shelley's time, when such terms as sublime or the OED's exalted have been used to acknowledge this higher claim. But it is necessary to make some linkage between the two senses: the written poem as verbal practice, and the grand thought of which it is claimed to be an expression. Are there clear criteria by which we can recognize that a particular piece of poetry belongs to the grander category? One factor here is scale. Nobody would deny the great classical epics, the works of Homer and Virgil, their standing as major instances of poetry and as historically significant. But how do we adjudicate between shorter writings? In his 1880 essay, The Study of Poetry, the Victorian critic and poet Matthew Arnold proposed that readers should have in their minds a series of touchstones, that is, pieces of writing whose greatness is agreed, against which other works can be tested to evaluate their worth. As an example of something which possessed an incontestable claim to poetic depth, T.S. Eliot proposed a line given to Piccardo Donati in the third canto of Dante's Paradiso, the third and final part of his Divine Comedy, completed in 1320 and widely considered one of the great works of world literature. She is describing the relationship to God of the blessed in heaven. An la sua volontade nostra pace, and in his will is our peace. In fact, Arnold had used the same line as a touchstone of excellence 3 times in the course of the 22 pages of The Study of Poetry. Where might we look for such excellence in English poetry? A. E. Housman, in The Name and Nature of Poetry in 1933, one of the most attractive English analyses of poetry, proposed these lines from Macbeth. Duncan is in his grave. After life's fitful fever, he sleeps well. This, Housman says, is poetry for which there is no other name. But how do we recognize or define such a quality? The end of Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn has had its proponents, though also its skeptics. Beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all. Ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. This sounds true, expressed in the generalizing form in which grand truths are often couched. But is this all we need to know on earth? Is the proposition itself true? And does it matter if it's not? It has sometimes been suggested that poetry belongs to the realm of the general truth, while prose is concerned with the particular. But particularity has also been praised as a virtue in poetry, Some greatly admired lines are very context-bound, such as the opening of the poem Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening by the American poet Robert Frost. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. Pronouncing on the nature of poetry and defining it is, then, a complex and disputed matter. But some recurrent oppositions might be noted at the outset. First of all, in the Western tradition, which of course is not the whole story, from the Greeks to the present day, the most fundamental distinction is between the idea of poetry, and art more generally, as either imitative or transcendent, either imitating life or reality or nature, or surpassing those things in a way that somehow compensates for their deficiencies. The distinction is expressed beautifully in the title of M. H. Abrams's great book on English Romantic poets, The Mirror and the Lamp. In its attempt to reconcile the two fundamental views of poetic operation, the title offers an elegant imagery for the two functions: poetry as a mirror that reflects reality by Aristotelian imitation of an existing source, or as a lamp, something independent of the external world that shines a new and perhaps transcendent light on it. The Aristotelian idea of art as imitation is most famously expressed in English by Hamlet: to hold, as 'twere, the mirror up to nature. But is poetry imitative or imaginative/creative? Much of the discussion of poetry can be conducted with this opposition, including, for example, the fundamental debate in English between Wordsworth and Coleridge, to which I will return, over whether there is a distinctive language of poetry. Not if, like Wordsworth, you believe that the role of poetry is to describe things by imitation in the real language of men, but there must be such a distinctive language if, like his friend Coleridge, you believe poetry depends on an inspired, transcendent faculty of imagination which will require its own language. As well as what poetry is, the other crucial question is what poetry is for, whether it has a duty of public utility and responsibility. This was Shelley's view when he made the famous claim we began with: for poets as the unacknowledged legislators, a role which clearly implies a sense of public responsibility. On the other hand, there is Auden's view that poetry makes nothing happen, which presumably liberates poets to go their own way while conceding their public insignificance. Poetry's obligations. But how well equipped is poetry to take on responsibility for public pronouncement? In the 20th century, Czesław Miłosz asked a somber question in his poem Dedication. What is poetry which does not save nations or people? Can a poem, it was asked in the same period, stop a tank? Such despair about the effectiveness of poetry was not new in the 20th century, particularly terrible though that century was thought to be, prompting as it did Theodor Adorno's bleak declaration that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. When the German critical philosopher Martin Heidegger asked in the mid-20th century, "What are poets for?" his title was echoing the poem Bread and Wine by Friedrich Hölderlin at the end of the 18th century. And what are poets for in a destitute time? Clearly, this question of social or political effectuality is at the heart of the matter. Even Plato said that there was no war in Homer's time which was conducted or advised or brought to a successful conclusion by him. If poetry is worthy of the grand claims made for it, including a claim for universality, it must meet such high political demands as were made for it in the 19th century by John Stuart Mill, and be of use in times of crisis. When the poet-playwright Václav Havel became president of the Czech Republic in 1990, his first address on New Year's Day attempted to refine the defeatist view of politics as the art of the possible, saying, "Let us teach ourselves that our politics can be not just the art of the possible, but that can even be the art of the impossible, namely the art of improving ourselves and the world." Havel's high-minded poet's view was fiercely opposed, but as well as being a noble program for politics, it is connecting with a traditional exalted view of poetry. In his celebrated disquisition on The Poet, given as a lecture in 1842 and published 2 years later, Ralph Waldo Emerson declared that poetry was all written before time was, and that the birth of a poet is the principal event in chronology. Sir Philip Sidney, in his Apology for Poetry, circa 1579, said poetry was the first light-giver to ignorance. On this view, poetry exists as something equivalent to nature, and the poet is the sensitive instrument that responds to this pre-existent thing to produce a poem. At the end of his lectures, collected as The Use of Poetry and the Use of Criticism, T.S. Eliot makes the same kind of claim for the prehistoric nature of poetry, saying, hyperbolically, one might say that the poet is older than other human beings. We are reminded of Walter Pater saying of the Mona Lisa that she is older than the rocks among which she sits. So, as urgent as the dispute about whether poetry is defined by its formal elements or its transcendent qualities, is the debate about the rights, wrongs, and obligations of poetry, whether it is obliged to be concerned with public matters. In the late 1930s, the German poet-playwright Bertolt Brecht's poem, In Dark Times, ends, "They won't say the times were dark. Rather, why were their poets silent?" After all, if Shelley's claim for poets as the unacknowledged legislators is to be taken with any seriousness, then some attention to the affairs of the world seems essential. Shelley's word, legislators, is a forceful one. Not just people whose writings have to be politely taken into account, but authorities who make binding laws of some kind. Pater, Emerson, and Eliot all claim a long prehistory as part of art's claim to authority. Perhaps this is what needs to be acknowledged as giving poetry the right to legislate. It has to be conceded, too, that legislation of the kind that Shelley is exalting is an idea that is dependent on political power. Insofar as there is any real truth in his heady proposition, the legislators of the world in the 19th century are likely to be already distinguished by class and sex. The extension of the legislature to women writers or writers of marginal political class or ethnicity has been a slow process. Though in the later 20th century, poets such as Judith Wright, campaigning for Australian Aboriginal rights, and Maya Angelou, an American civil rights activist, expressed strong and effective political views in their poems. So the question of whether an established sense of ethical responsibility and capacity are what poetry is fundamentally for can still be raised. What is the social utility of this phenomenon which, as we will hear, seems to exist in all societies? The necessity of moral motivation has also commonly been questioned. Poetry not only cannot, but should not be involved in public debate. Coleridge defines a poem as that species of composition which is opposed to works of science by proposing for its immediate object pleasure, not truth. In Seamus Heaney's Station Island, a fictional James Joyce tells Heaney to please himself rather than to see poetry as the pursuit of virtue. You lose more of yourself than you redeem doing the decent thing, he tells him. So is poetry at liberty to please itself, to be, in Yeats's fine word, self-delighting, in keeping with Coleridge's view that its primary function is to delight rather than to instruct? If it does revise its ambitions in this way, presumably it is foregoing Shelley's claim to legislate for the world. In England, debates about the duties and freedoms of poetry were first conducted in the Elizabethan period, when the Puritans' strictures on the irresponsibility of the poets prompted the response of the apologists, such as Sidney's Apology and a bit later Ben Jonson's Discoveries. In the influential introduction to his anthology of Elizabethan critical essays, G. Gregory Smith goes as far as to say we should be grateful to the Puritan haters of poetry. He uses the remarkable Greek term misomousi for provoking the sympathetic arguments of the apologists for it. Concerns with the duties or freedoms of the poet were much discussed again in the 1930s in England. The Irish poets Louis MacNeice and his contemporary C. Day Lewis, they later modified their position, argued sternly for impure poetry, poetry that gets its hands dirty with public matters, even if that is doing the decent thing. We find the grand romantic claims to authority often bluntly dismissed by their successors, like MacNeice and Day-Lewis's collaborator Auden, who, writing his great elegy for Yeats, said, "Poetry makes nothing happen." Already in the Romantic period itself, Keats, in a letter to Reynolds on the 9th of April 1818, was sweepingly dismissive of the public answerability of the poet. I never wrote one single line of poetry with the least shadow of public thought. On the other hand, many romantic contemporaries of Shelley took the view that poetry was reprehensible in eschewing public engagement. Shelley's romantic claim for the transcendent authority of poetry can be widely paralleled in other eras ever since the classical past. The most authoritative classical predecessor in raising the question is the Latin poet Horace, who said that the function of poetry, broadly speaking, is to instruct, prodesse, rather than delectare, to please. It is a choice which is certainly more significant than the matter of writing in verse forms or not, and one which has had a greater centrality in the discussion of poetry through history. Is the function of poetry primarily to instruct or to amuse? If it is a matter of instruction, this might warrant the grand authority Shelley ascribes to it. Sidney, without advancing the same claim for legislative authority, had declared that, of all sciences, is our poet the monarch, intending the winning of the mind from wickedness to virtue. So the obligation of public answerability in the poet may be seen as a subsection of poetry's general requirement of a sense of responsibility and moral worth. But is the poet obliged to tell the truth at all, whether morally improving or not? Poetry makes things up. In his Apology, Sidney made a famous and ingenious claim that the poet nothing affirms, and therefore never lieth. For, as I take it, to lie is to affirm that to be true which is false. Both its advocates and its detractors agree that poetry can be fictive. In 1766, Richard Hurd, who was influential in his time, said that poetry entails three things: figurative language, fiction, that is, non-dependence on what is demonstrably the case for its acceptance, and versification. Its fictiveness can be either a virtue, a requirement of the Romantics' theory of the imagination, and an essential for the American poet Wallace Stevens, or it can be a failing, according to Plato and Jeremy Bentham. Bentham's utilitarian view in The Rationale of Reward, 1825, is particularly forcefully put: the poet always stands in need of something false. Truth, exactitude of every kind, is fatal in poetry. Long before, the Greeks held strong views about the moral standing of the poet. According to Diogenes Laertius, Pythagoras claimed to have seen in a vision Hesiod and Homer being tortured in Hades for their irresponsible lies. Hesiod screaming in pain, attached to a bronze pillar, and Homer hung from a serpent-infested tree. Heraclitus declared that Homer deserved to be flogged. Sidney saw pleasure and instruction as inextricable motivations in poetry, teaching through delighting, but many poetic traditions have seen pleasure as the more important. For instance, the Chinese text known as the Classic of Poetry, 1100 to 600 BC, which is said to feature the world's earliest example of rhymed verse, celebrates the pleasures of sexual love among the things with which poetry is concerned. In returning to ask what the duties of the poet are, it is striking once again how recurrent this question of poetry's functions and duties is across widely separated cultures and eras, and it is a fundamental question that we find addressed throughout the history of English poetry, from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, with their division into stories of sentence or solace, moralizing or comfort, to Sidney in the passage I have just quoted, to the Romantics, and modern skeptics like Philip Larkin. Might ethical motivation, then, be what poetry is primarily for, the validation in social utility of this phenomenon which seems to exist in all societies? Of recent books on poetry in English, the one that makes the case for its public responsibility most passionately is the volume on poetry in the Oxford University Press series, The Literary Agenda, by the poet and Hölderlin scholar David Constantine. His last two chapters are called The Office of Poetry and The Public Good, and they start from an observation by Czesław Miłosz. Never has there been a close study of how necessary to a man are the experiences which we clumsily call aesthetic. This observation is the heart of the matter in requiring a sense of the public good in poetry. Chaucer called it common profit. The demand is not necessarily for engaged involvement in the politics of a particular time, but for an awareness of the importance of the world beyond the poet. Such awareness is what entitles poetry to be taken seriously. From the time of Aristotle to the European Renaissance, it has been said that a view of writing that linked to philosophy outweighed mere artifice in writing, however skilled. Much as he admired Chaucer, Arnold regretted that his lack of what he called high seriousness, spudaites in Greek, disqualified him from inclusion among the very greatest poets. Formal skills associated with metrics, scansion, and the like were relatively low valued as the arts of the journeyman writer, while the concern of the serious commentator was with the field of inquiry that the method was applied to. The universality of poetry. Ezra Pound said, "Poetry is a composition of words set to music. Most other definitions of it are indefensible or metaphysical." Anthony Storr's inspirational book, Music and the Mind, begins, "No culture so far discovered lacks music. Making music appears to be one of the fundamental activities of mankind, as characteristically human as drawing and painting. The same seems to be true of poetry, which, of course, has close connections with music. All cultures practice it, whether or not they have writing systems. Furthermore, this phenomenon seems to enjoy a universally high status. In the words of the Russian-American poet Joseph Brodsky, poetry is the supreme form of human locution in any culture, on grief and reason. The American-Serbian poet Charles Simic says, "My view is that poetry is inevitable, irreplaceable, and necessary as daily bread. Even if we were to find ourselves living in the crummiest country in the world, in an age of unparalleled vileness and stupidity, we'd find that poetry still got written." The same point had been made more engagingly in Sidney's Apology for Poetry, which competes with Shelley's Defence for recognition as the most attractive of the English anatomies of poetry, when he salutes the great passport of poetry, which in all nations at this day, where learning flourisheth not, is plain to be seen, in all which they have some feeling of poetry. Even in our neighbour country Ireland, where truly learning goeth very bare. In the same period, George Puttenham, in The Art of English Poesy, 1589, says that in all nations there is some feeling of poetry. The most famous claim for universality in poetry was made by Goethe in a much-quoted letter to Johann Peter Eckermann in 1827, where he proposed the notion of Weltliteratur, world literature, an idea which has had a great deal of attention in the early 21st century. Goethe writes, "I am more and more convinced that poetry is the universal possession of mankind, revealing itself everywhere and at all times in hundreds and hundreds of men. I like to look about me in foreign nations and advise everyone to do the same. National literature is now a rather unmeaning term. The epoch of world literature is at hand." But this universal occurrence of literature does not mean that the form it takes or what it is understood to be is the same for all ages and societies. So, Goethe says it is necessary to look about in foreign nations, because no single version of poetry or literature is to be thought predominant or the model for all. We must not give this value to the Chinese or the Serbian or Calderon or the Nibelungen, but, despite this salutary warning against any kind of ethnocentrism in the definition of poetry, Goethe concedes that if we really want a pattern, we must always return to the ancient Greeks, in whose works the beauty of mankind is constantly represented. This grounding of literature on a Greek foundation has been central to the definition of poetry in the Western tradition. It was particularly marked among the Romantics. In his preface to Hellas, Shelley said, "We are all Greeks. Our laws, our literature, our religion, our arts have their roots in Greece." This bias demoted even the Romans, presumably including Horace, with his cherished pronouncements on poetry among them. Shelley adds, "But for Greece, Rome would have spread no illumination with her arms." But we still have to bear in mind the prejudices that this veneration for Greek carries with it. David Hawkes, writing about Chinese poetry, warns us that no guarantee of universality ever attaches to generalizations about European literature. We, Europeans, are all, as it were, children of the book. All have passed through the winepress of Aristotle. We must, as Goethe himself said, look beyond the Greeks, in foreign nations and cultures. An even more problematic concern about world literature is that the limitations of coverage extend well beyond the issue of Greek dominance. Poetry occurs everywhere, but in the era of globalization, the poetry of much of the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?